Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. While you're joining our space, please comment in the chat your name, your location, your organization, and your favorite activity during the winter. We're going to give folks a few minutes to come in. We'll get started in just a few. Hi, Jasmine. Thanks for being here. Sure, Joy. The question's also on the main slide here. If you could just put in the chat your name, your location, organization, and your favorite winter holiday, favorite winter activity. Mm, Rebecca, I am right there with you. Reading. Let me stay inside in the cold. Yep. Seeing a lot of staying inside and cuddling. You are my people. That is right up my alley. Thanks everyone for being here. I think we are going to get started just in a few minutes. While you're rolling in, please type in the chat your name, location, organization, and favorite winter activity. Wonderful. Okay, we are going to get started. If you want to continue dropping in your intros, we'd love to hear from you. But welcome everyone to the Culture Performance Connection, Shaping Teams for Strategic Impact. As you're coming in, continue to share your introductions in the chat. We'd love to hear who you are and what brought you here today. My name is Joanna. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm on the marketing team here at Edgility. I'll be your webinar support today, so if you have any problems, feel free to message me privately on the side. There will be time for participation throughout the webinar. Feel free to add your questions to the chat and we'll do our best to answer live. But if we don't get to your questions at that moment, we will circle back and get to them at the end during our question and answers time. Other times throughout the webinar, we'll be posting polls. So just select whichever answer matches your experience best and we'll go from there. This session is being recorded and it will be sent out to you afterward. If you have to hop at a certain point, you will get the full webinar, so don't worry about that. I am going to now hand things over to our hosts. We're very lucky to have such a robust panel of experts. From Edgility, we have co-founder and managing partner Allison Wyatt and principal Marissa McNeil. And from Third Plateau, we have co-founder and principal Jonathan Kaufman and senior director and executive coach Jeannie Howell. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Joanna. I will kick us off by telling everyone a little bit about what we do here at Edgility. So Edgility is a national executive search and human capital consulting firm. My role at the firm is I run our human capital consulting practice. And essentially what we do in that side of the house is help organizations design compensation programs to be externally competitive, internally equitable, and fiscally responsible. And then also support organizations to make sure they have all of the talent infrastructure surrounding that in a way that it really reinforces their values and culture and helps them to manifest that through all of their talent programs, systems, and philosophy. And now I will hand it over to my colleagues at Third Plateau to tell you a little bit about themselves.
Thank you, Allison. So really excited to be here with everybody. Third Plateau is a strategy consulting firm working on social impact across the sector. whether it's for foundations or nonprofits, helping organizations and individuals have the greatest possible impact for the resources they have at their disposal. And so all of our services are really focused on how we can help get organizations smarter and more equipped to be able to address the most pressing needs in their community. As you can hear from the way that Allison and I describe our organizations, it's become pretty clear to us that there is a really nice fit between what we can each offer organizations and how those really blend together, really bringing sort of two different schools of thought that blend into really helping organizations with a more holistic understanding of what they need to help make their organizations and teams as strong as possible. We had a whole lot of ideas of what we could have talked about today, but really excited to get to focus on one of the things we think is most critical, which is really how culture and performance need to work hand in hand and how those two things can really reinforce each other. So excited to have everybody here and looking forward to getting into it.
Great. So we're going to kick off with a little poll that's tied to what we're talking about today. So our first question is, do you have a defined set of organizational values? And these are just yes or no's. You can select them right on your screen. Then we're asking, do you know what they are? Do you practice them? Are they explicit, right? Are they understood and articulated? Are they alive for staff? So go ahead, we'll take a minute here and we'll react to these polls. All right, so I'm seeing for the first question, do you have a defined set of organizational values? The majority are yes here at 84%. We still got some coming in. Are we actively practicing them? The majority are yes here again. And now what I'm expecting to see and what I am seeing trends here is that this last question has a higher percentage of no than the previous questions. Are they understood, articulated? Are they alive, right? And this is what we see with a lot of our clients in the space. We have our values as an organization. Maybe they're implicit, but maybe staff don't know about them. And we need to do a better job of drawing that through line between our values as an organization and our practices. All right, thanks for participating, all.
All right, thank you. All right, so let's get in. We want to be able to talk about what organizational culture is and why you should invest in it. It sounds like we've got some of the great blocks here set up, but we can get a lot smarter about how we actually leverage this and think about it with some agency. I want to start by really framing that culture happens anytime two or more people are working together. It's not something that you can avoid. It's not something you should try to see an organization without. It's also not something that just automatically happens and is good. It automatically happens. It forms, it creates, and starts to take a life of its own. And so we really need to think about, is that something that's just happening by accident, or are there ways that as organizational leaders, we can lean in and actually have some agency to shape it in a way that we want? One way that I think is really helpful to think about organizational culture is to actually zoom way out and to think about what are some of those key organizational building blocks and where does culture fit in. So at its foundation, we always want to be thinking about what our communities need. All of us are here to do some type of social good, to see our communities be stronger, more effective, more vibrant than what we see today. There's some bold vision for what we want to see in that world and some real community anchored understanding of either pain points or opportunities that we feel equipped to go address. Once we understand what that community need is, we want to start to shape our organization. And that's really anchored in kind of two big pieces. The first one is the value proposition. What is the thing that you can provide that actually addresses that community need? How are you helping make that process or that experience, that community better? What's the unique value that you're adding into that community? The business model is how you actually operationalize it. Where does your money come from? How do you actually think about your partnerships? How do the people that you care about helping, how do they actually get the thing you're trying to offer them? So this often looks like the initial idea of an organization of saying, oh, I can address this idea. Here's how I think this can look. I understand why I want to do this. And then it gets to like, okay, well, how are you actually going to make that happen? And this is really where two pieces start to fit hand in hand. One is you need a strategic plan, right? We need to think about what is the actual way that we're going to drive that forward in the next couple of years. Most likely, the community need you want to address is not something that's going to get solved in 2 or 3 or 5 years' time. It likely took generations for that need to form, and it'll likely take generations for us to truly address and resolve that need. So the strategic plan is saying, I can't do all of it right now. Here's what I'm going to focus on in the short term to make sure that I'm investing my resources and energy where I think there's the greatest value to be had. The culture plan you can see is the sort of the right-hand partner to the strategic plan. Strategic plan is how your organization is going to be designed to be able to make traction and move the needle on that issue you care about in the short term. Your culture plan is how all of those wonderful humans that actually need to do the work are going to work together. How they play together. What does that environment look like? How do we make sure that they are rising to the challenge and able to meet their full potential so that your strategic plan can also meet its full potential to deliver the need you care about to the community? Once you have a really strong strategic plan and a culture plan, then you can actually get to the pieces that we care about a lot in terms of like, let's go do it well. And what that looks like is really strong performance management. Are people leveraging the culture to drive the strategic plan forward to address the community need I care about? And if we're able to align those efforts, then we can get to the thing that matters here about having healthy, sustainable, and effective organizations that are actually addressing that community need that started this whole chain reaction in the first place. Now, if we don't have that culture plan and we don't think about that organizational strategy, it destabilizes the top part of this house that we are trying to invest in. It makes it wobbly, and it actually can cost us the success that we could have in our work. You can have a beautiful strategic plan, but if you don't have a culture to help hold it up and keep it sustainable, it's not actually going to do anything. It'll be a nice document. Maybe it's even a really shiny binder, and that's about the end of it. It'll collect dust on a shelf, and then we've got to figure out what to do with it from there. But if we're able to actually think about this more holistically and be able to build that strategic plan and build out a culture plan for what those humans can do and how they can work together, we can build a really, really strong house for how we take a community need, align all of our energy to do something about it, get a really good strategic plan and culture, drive our performance so we're actually moving the needle on the thing we care about. It's what started everything. So I saw a lot of comments there or notes in the survey that a lot of us have values, which we think are somehow part of culture, but we're not really like they're not actionable. We're not using them in a meaningful way. Maybe it's something nice that's sort of up on the wall of your office, or it's in a tagline on your email, but that's maybe the extent of it. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Jeannie to be able to talk about like how do we actually think about designing and building culture, because it's not just guesswork. We actually can take a lot of agency and shaping it to be something that's really useful for our organization. Jeannie?
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so when we're working with clients, they come to us and they want to really look into their culture and define it, build it, make it stronger, make it actionable. There are essentially three phases that we go through when we're doing a culture plan. The first one is defining values. Like Jonathan mentioned, a lot of you mentioned that you have values, but a lot can change, right? New people come on board, new leadership, mergers, acquisitions. There's all kinds of things that can change. And so it's really important to define and understand what the core values are, and what are those norms that we set to inform how those values manifest every day. The second phase is to put those values into action, right? They're not just stated, like Jonathan said, or pasted on an office wall. Your culture is defined by those actions on that day to day. What are those policies? What are the best practices that can really boast and strengthen your organization? There are three main areas that we look at when we're doing a culture plan. I'm going to show you a case study here in a minute. But those three main areas that we see values really manifest on a day-to-day basis is recruitment and onboarding, daily reinforcement, and celebration and accountability. So hold those in your mind, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. And then maintaining and nurturing, right? How will you continue to tend to your culture, right? How do we ensure that this work that you're putting in now is going to continue in the long run? Who's actually going to be your champion and make sure that all those actions and those daily reinforcements are actually coming to fruition? So you can go to the next slide. So we have a quick case study, and we're actually going to use ourselves. Third Plateau went through a culture plan refresh last year. And, as our team grew significantly, we wanted to use this as an example to see how we went from values to culture. So here are our firm's values, and they're truncated here for ease, and you're welcome to read them in their entirety on the website. But we use the UP nomenclature to not just be an easy way to understand what our values are, but to inject some action and some energy into our values. They're kinetic, right? You'll also notice that we have just 4 values. And we do that because organizations are going to need to want at least 3 to 5. Fewer than that, there's not enough direction. And then more than that, it just kind of devalues each one. So I think the sweet spot really is around 4. We're going to take a closer look at the next slide. When we want to put values into action, we're going to take a look at just one of these. So learn up. Again, I won't read the whole thing, but I just highlighted kind of the essence of this is we're committing to continuous learning and adaptation in our work. And so in the culture planning process, we go through each value and we filter them through those 3 main areas that we want to see this value boost into action. So those 3 areas are recruitment and onboarding, right? How do we communicate this value out to those that we want to attract as team members, right? How do we reinforce this value in that first crucial week to really hone in on the fact that this is a really important part of where you're now, a part of the team? Daily reinforcement is what are those actions that allow us to live this value every day? And finally, how are we going to celebrate it? How are we going to monitor and hold ourselves accountable for all this work that we just did, right? So some of the areas that we created with our entire team, right, not just the leadership, our entire team looked at these 4 values and said, all right, let's look at Learn Up. How does this actually manifest? And so here are some of the areas that we actually came up with in terms of reinforcing that value on a day-to-day basis. So my final thought here really is just when you lead with values, you can ensure that your culture is going to continue to flourish, right? It's going to allow your team to feel a sense of consistency, a sense of belonging. And not only that, but it's going to boost their performance too, which Jonathan is going to sort of walk through how this sort of influences performance. Jonathan?
Thanks, Jeannie. So the way that we're describing and thinking about values is it's really about our non-negotiables. What are the things that need to be true about us, how we show up individually, what we expect of our colleagues, what we should expect from the organization, day in and day out. And so if we think about these as like non-negotiables, the way that we are thinking about our organization, it's really helping shape the way that we are all playing. It's taking implicit concepts of what we expect of each other and making them really explicit. And that's really what great culture planning is all about. It's about taking these implicit ideas and making it explicit so it's not guesswork as to how you want to show up, what you expect from other people. The more explicit we can make those expectations, the easier it is for people to perform well, to live up to those and excel with them, and to not have that miscommunication that can often shoot teams in the foot. So if we think of that, culture is going to happen anytime 2 or more humans are doing something together. And that culture is going to have an outsized impact about what's possible with our organizations, with the impact that we want to have. We can either leave it to chance and hope that it's successful, or we can use some of these tools that Jeannie is describing here to actually have some agency and shape it with intention. We get a chance to work with organizations all over the world doing all sorts of amazing things. And I can tell you, thinking back of all of the clients we've worked with, I can't think of wildly successful organizations that haven't had a vibrant culture. I can't think of organizations that had decent, like pretty good cultures and not great strategy that still were somehow successful. Sometimes you can get lucky on those pieces, but really it's about marrying those together of having a great strategy and a great culture is what really allows us to drive that. That negative culture is going to lead to a lot of turnover, to low morale, a lack of trust. You're going to spend so much energy and time trying to attract and recruit new people, train them up, only to have them not want to be there. And a lot of the work we're talking about when we're trying to talk about addressing community needs requires a long game. And if you're constantly churning through people, it's really, really difficult to play a long game. On the flip side, when you have that strong culture that's attracting truly phenomenal humans, enables them to work together with their colleagues really effectively, it creates a culture where you've got these shared values, people feel empowered and have some agency to do their best work, and people are able to really focus on that organizational objective of what is it we need to do and what's the role I can play in helping make that possible. So this is really where our partnership with Edgility becomes really critical, because it's not enough to just say, let's take that culture that's implicit and make it explicit. Let's actually take it a step further and think about how do we actually help ignite people with that to really drive their own individual and team-wide performance. So Allison, I'll turn it over to you and you can start to open up the door into that part of the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that performance management is honestly where the rubber meets the road when it comes to making those, implicit values explicit in your organization and really reinforcing that culture that you're trying to build, right? So we're going to spend some time sharing more about how you bring that to life through your performance management system. And Marissa's going to get us started.
Thank you. Yeah, so thinking back, right, to Third Plateau's point about being intentional about the culture that you're setting, one of the ways to be intentional is to ensure that your systems and processes that you're implementing internally are having a positive impact on the culture of your team. So if you want to ensure that your talent management or employee success program, however you want to frame it, right, is doing what you want it to do, it should be hitting these key areas. And also shout out to Joanna, because this slide I feel like took hundreds of years of work and 40 pages of my notes and condensed it perfectly to summarize, right, what we're looking for with your performance management system. So the first one amplifies the organization's values for employees, right? Back to our poll at the beginning, staff should be able to clearly articulate what the values of the organization are. And then we should be able to draw that direct through line from your values to your policies and practices. That even ties to the second point, where it increases accountability for staff and leaders. So if we say that we greatly value community and working together and collaboration, let's build that into our performance management system, right, as one of our key indicators of success. It should be encouraging honest and authentic lines of communication between staff members and their managers, between team members, project members, right? Honest feedback about what's working well, what are some areas for opportunity. And really importantly, from a business strategy perspective, it's answering strategic questions about talent in an actionable way. And this ties to the next one, where by clarifying the bar for success, that can inform strategic growth plans for staff and lead to meaningful career advancement. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, okay, as an organization, there's a business need, right? A role opens up that we need to fill. If we have a strong performance management system, we should be able to critically assess who on our team might be a great fit for that position, right? And not only is that smart because it's way easier and more cost effective, right, to recruit internally than to recruit externally. We know that, but also that sets the culture, right? You're investing in your staff, you're providing them pathway opportunity. And that's came from you having a strong framework where you were able to assess their ability to step into that role. It also fosters an inclusive process that incorporates perspectives from a diverse array of data sets, right? Not just your individual metrics and KPIs, but also how well you're working on your team. And this last one, I wish I could bold and double click. It demonstrates that employees are a company's greatest asset. And I think there's a big reframe happening, right, in the external labor market where staff are not just an expense or a cost to an employer, they are an investment. And by investing in your staff, growing them, supporting their professional development, you're demonstrating to them that you value them. Culture is a business decision. And so by investing in your staff and uplifting your community, you're supporting the sustainability of your business over time.
Great. And I love the question in the chat right now about, well, how do we do this when, we have people located in several different locations, or if you're a remote organization, you may not even have brick and mortar where you bring people together. And I think that this all becomes even more important right now, right? Because the more you can get explicit about what values look like in action, and the more you can build talent programs that reinforce those things, the less you're dependent on happenstance, being together in person and having those things kind of happen organically. So I think that that's a great question, and really just showcases how this is even more important nowadays, just given what the typical workforce looks like geographically speaking. I think that, you have to get this right? It's such a critical piece. And I think that oftentimes organizations, it can be tempting to sort of like download a template off of the internet, right? Or not really think through the key questions and what this looks like in your organization. So if you're going to do this well, you really need to start with, well, what are the big questions that you're trying to answer, right? What are the things that your performance management data is going to tell you and help inform you make decisions around? And really, for most of us, the questions you're looking to answer in a program like this is, who's doing well? Who on your team is really doing well, and needs to be recognized and acknowledged for their great work, right? But also, who isn't? Who's struggling, right? Because if you don't know the answer to that question, how can you design interventions and provide support or begin a transition process, right? And then finally, who is overperforming, so that you're really able to know who's ready to take the next step? Who do you have on the bench and in the wings to step into, leadership positions and roles that may emerge, right? And how do you keep them challenged, engaged, and moving so that you don't lose your best people? The first thing you have to do to manage your talent well is know the answer immediately to those three questions, right? The other thing is that, you really have to understand kind of what goes into answering those questions, right? So part of it is the outcomes, right? So that's usually like your KPIs, and, what people achieved and accomplished, right? But part of it is also, are they demonstrating the competencies to show that, it wasn't just a year where, for example, if you're in a recruiting role, finding that type of talent was like catching fish in a barrel, right? They really demonstrated that they mastered the competencies of building a strong pipeline as a recruiter for that type of talent, right? It wasn't happenstance. And then finally, most importantly, right, is, are they aligned with your culture and values? So this is really going to answer the question of, well, you can achieve your goals and demonstrate that you know how to use your job, but if one of our core values is collaboration, and you stepped on people as you got there, that's a problem, right? And a lot of times we see organizations overemphasize the first two things, and that kills culture, right? And so when you're looking at your performance management program, you want to be looking at all three of those factors to make sure you're building the type of organization that you want to build over time, and that house doesn't come crashing down, right? And so I think that that's kind of, those are the three kind of magic ingredients, right? How do you do this on a day-to-day basis? Again, another pitfall with performance management is it's a once or twice a year conversation. Maybe it happens quarterly, right? But really, this should be an ongoing conversation, right? At least monthly communication along the way. And I think that another sort of, you know, pro tip would be to kind of keep a journal, keep some sort of written record over the course of the year, so that when you get to the end of the year, you're not just giving a performance review based on whatever happened the most recently in the past couple of months or what you happen to remember, right? That's going to really make it so that you can give a more robust process, right? And then finally, you know, we always recommend collecting lots of perspectives. So, you know, a manager is a really important perspective when it comes to performance management. Oftentimes, you know, these programs will have an employee self-review and a manager component, but we really think that that's a pretty limited perspective on a specific individual, and recommend trying to get lots of data, you know, employees 360 feedback processes, or external client data. There's lots of ways you can kind of fill in those gaps. And now I'm going to hand it back to Marissa to tell you a little bit more about how do you do this in a really equitable way that's fair to all of your employees.
Thank you, Allison. So if the culture that you're trying to build and nurture are these things, right? So inclusion and belonging, clarity and transparency, fairness and consistency, how does that actively show up in the way that you're designing your performance management system? So if I value as an organization inclusion and belonging, then we aim to have reward, recognition, well-being, and equity audit processes that foster an inclusive and belonging performance culture. If we as an organization value clarity and transparency, then we aim to have a clear and transparent performance management system that clearly articulates our expectations and what our bar for success is at our organization. Because I will tell you that looks different from organization to organization, right? Is your bar proficiency and meeting competency, or is your bar mastery and excelling, right? Staff should have clear line of sight into how to access success at your organization. And then if you value fairness and consistency, then you aim to be consistent and fair in your performance feedback conversations by having a structured process, right? And training managers. I'm going to get more into this, each one on the next slides, and give you some actionable steps that you can take to make sure that you're implementing this successfully. So let's start with inclusion and belonging. So what does this look like? A talent philosophy development framework, right? This is a great opportunity to engage diverse groups of staff within your organization. So we recommend a diverse group of stakeholders, all different job levels, teams, departments, roles, gender identity, racial, ethnic identity. Typically folks who don't have a seat at the table for those kinds of conversations. What do you see as the values of your organization? What do you value? And then we can codify a talent philosophy, and that acts as our Northern Star for the policies and practices that we're implementing, right? And then again, holds us as leaders accountable to our values and our philosophy. You can also run a staff satisfaction survey. And these are great because now you're hearing from all staff. So you don't even have to convene a group within your organization, right? All staff are going to have the opportunity to have their perspectives and their voices heard by the management team, by the HR team, the people team. And then I'll probably say this 6 more times before the end of the presentation, but data tracking, I am a data analyst at my core. And so if you are not tracking trends in your data by different demographic groups, by different variables, right, then you're not able to gut check that your program's running effectively. And so again, to further inclusion and belonging as our value, track some trends by retention. Are there certain teams, departments, groups with really high retention rates as opposed to others? As well as development trends based on your performance management system. And then it's always a great idea to assemble task forces, again, that are representative of diverse backgrounds within your company. Now, when I'm thinking about clarity and transparency, okay, we do all this great work. We develop a framework that we believe in. We develop a talent empowerment framework. everything needs to be documented, right? Write it down. And also, if you don't repeat it 70,000 times, you never said it, right? Let's make sure that it's accessible to all staff. We're all diverse learners, right? Written format, video format, office hours, allow the opportunity for staff to ask questions. This encourages honest and open feedback. And again, codifying the bar. What is the bar so that we're appropriately assessing people against that bar? It's not fair to have a metric or a parameter and you're assessing this person against this parameter and they don't know it, right? That's not fair. And then lastly, fairness and consistency. I teed it up here. So it's critical to have calibration sessions across raters, manager training sessions. Again, we do all this great work, but let's say a manager in this department interprets it differently than a manager in that department, especially if you're tying performance management to pay. If people are interpreting the framework differently, if you don't have a proper training and calibration session, one manager scoring all fours, another scoring all twos, that's going to come out in the compensation, right? And then that's definitely going to impact the culture and folks are going to talk. We hear this all the time. Whenever Allison and I run studies together, all we hear is, they all got fours, they all got twos. I don't know where there's inconsistency in the scoring, right? And then that's going to be perceived as unfair because it is unfair. Even if you have this great framework that you spent all this time developing and codifying with these values in mind, if it's not implemented successfully, all that great work goes out the window. And then for my second plug of this presentation, again, the gap and adverse impact analysis, right? So you have the scores. I love a pilot program. So you do your performance management, you have a pilot program for a year, those scores come in, you run the scores by division, by team department, by manager, by demographic identity group, and see if there's any trends. Is anything inadvertently popping up? That's an opportunity to take that information, make updates as necessary, and re-administer the program. It's about having a standardized framework, but remaining flexible in the reality that things happen, right? And so we need to be adaptive, but we need to have that framework set for fairness and consistency. And so now I'll pass it back over to Allison to walk us through a little case study.
Thank you, Marissa. Yeah, I always say that your performance rating should have more to do with your actual performance than, who rated you and whether they're a tough grader or not a tough grader. And so we're going to dig a little bit more into what does that look like in practice? How do you kind of weave these things together in one specific area of your performance management program? And again, where the rubber starts to meet the road is usually in that end of year review. So we're going to show you a little bit of what this looks like in practice. So we've talked today a lot about clarifying the bar, both so that your staff understand what success looks like, but also so that your managers can be far more consistent in their ratings and what they're even expecting people to demonstrate in their roles. And so the way that typically works is to start by thinking about what we call a competency model. And this is just really looking at, for every single level of your organization, what are the competencies that we expect everybody to demonstrate, or what are the values that we expect everybody to bring to the table? So, that may look different for somebody who's just starting their career versus somebody who is in a role that's at an executive level where they maybe have 20 years of experience and a larger scope of responsibility. You need to kind of define for yourself and your people what the expectations are at each level. We also find that sometimes there are competencies that cut across the whole organization, and then sometimes there are other competencies that look different depending on which division you work in. So maybe there are some competencies that are really critical in a communications function, but that aren't as critical in a finance function. And so sometimes we find our clients differentiate depending on the function a person is in, and also whether or not that individual has management responsibilities. So these are all things you can think about what makes sense for your organization. I will say the larger you get, the more you start to have those different cuts. If you're a smaller organization, I would start with just figuring out what are kind of those core competencies and values that you want to outline across the whole org. And I'll give you an example of what this can look like at the different levels. So this is just looking at one competency, problem solving, and expertise in a given role, right? And what you'll notice about this, and you can look at it in more detail in the takeaway, but what I will highlight is that as you get more senior in the organization, you're expected to be able to solve problems with more independence, to be able to solve more complex challenges that are less routine, maybe more one-off in unique circumstances, to be able to engage broader teams in addressing those challenges, and to also be able to show more of a through line to how these problems are solving broader, functional challenges or regional goals, or contributing to organizational strategy, and eventually may even impact the whole organization. So they increase in complexity, scope, level of independence, etc., as you get more senior. This just kind of illustrates how you might break a competency down at different levels. Now, obviously, there's no one right way to do this, right? You have to answer these questions for your organization. And I will say that more often than not, the reason organizations haven't articulated these things is because they haven't taken the time to answer these questions and figure out what really matters, what really leads to success at our organization, and how does that look different depending on the person's level. So once you've, developed your competencies and defined how they evolve over time at different levels, then we have to make sure that our managers really understand what success looks like. So having some sort of rating scale that defines for each of those items, what is proficient, right? And some organizations break these down, right? Some organizations will give a staff member one rating for their goals and metrics, one for their competencies, and one for their values. And those three things feed into kind of an overall rating. That's also a philosophical choice point that you can make. Maybe you weight those things differently. Maybe they're equally weighted, right? There's a lot of different design decisions that you can take as you think about these things. But I think the first step is to kind of articulate what the bar is, and then at least have a some sort of rubric that managers can use. And to Marissa's point, to do some calibration. You can use scenarios. You can use, actual people and have like a collaborative rating session where managers get feedback from each other. There's all different ways to calibrate across teams. But again, ultimately, at the end of the day, what you don't want is your performance ratings to be dependent on who the manager is. You really want it to be based on the staff's actual level of performance. Otherwise, people can get really frustrated, and rightly so. And it's also not giving you the data you need, right? You really need that talent assessment of, where you have hot spots, where you have bright spots, things like that. So we're going to move on to think more about what you do with all of this and what your next steps might look like.
Thanks, Allison. So I want to make sure we have time for we have a lot of really great questions, and I want to get into those. So think of this as sort of your personal homework assignment for today, right? Are your values and culture clearly and transparently defined? Are they stuck on a wall, or are those things actually in action? Are your talent programs aligned with those values? And then what is one action you're taking from this session today? How are you going to prioritize that and implement it in your organization moving forward? So just a couple, little pieces of food for thought for you to think through. And if there are things you want to share with others, feel free to post them in the chat. But hopefully there's some good nuggets in there for you to ponder through as you kind of reflect on today's session.
Thank you so much. We had some really active questions going on through the chat throughout, so we're going to circle back to those. A few were answered throughout, so if you feel like your question wasn't answered, feel free to drop it back in, and we will answer that as well. I think this question was aimed for Janine. So Veronica asked, I'm curious to know how you landed on these values. Was it determined top down and relayed, identified through themes and engagement surveys?
Yeah, really great question. I think one of the great things about the defining the values portion of culture planning is we do a lot of different sessions with the entire team. We call it values mining, where we actually go in and, we'll start with really basic questions like, think about a time where you felt the most proud to be a part of this organization. There's so much embedded in those types of questions. And we can take a lot of that information through in-person sessions, web sessions, surveys for those that aren't able to join, and start to sort of synthesize what those potential values can be. And so we did a similar type of process for Third Plateau. We had sort of the core values that we sort of have been using, but as a refresh, we revisited them. Are these still the values we still hold dear? Are they reflective of how we operate both internally and externally? So that's a little bit on how that actually came to be. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Jonathan.
No, I think that's spot on. I think the piece I'll just highlight here is even if you're sitting right now and you feel like your values at your organization are not quite right, or you don't quite have the right culture, but it's not like you're building a team. You have an existing team that might be 3 people, it might be 5,000 people. It's not too late to do this. You just need to go through an exercise like what Jeannie is highlighting here of like helping hear from your team about what the goal here with the values is there's some secret sauce your organization is trying to cook. And secret sauce is great. It's like, oh, it's fun. I like this. It's got a secret sauce. The people in the kitchen, it's not a secret sauce to them. They know the recipe. They know all the ingredients and they can cook that secret sauce exactly the same way every single day. Your goal is to stop being a customer of that secret sauce of your culture and actually get back into the kitchen and figure out what are the ingredients, what is the recipe for how we cook this. And you need to hear from the people that are actually thinking about that and doing it so that then you can start to codify it. And that's really what a culture plan is doing. It's codifying that secret sauce recipe so that it's no longer guesswork and it's not just maybe it's good or maybe it's bad. It's good and we know exactly how to continually deliver on it and continually make it better. And so that's an everybody involved process. That is not you and senior leadership sitting in a black box somewhere and saying, here are the values. Those will be the values to you, but they won't be the values to the rest of your team. And if we think of these truly as non-negotiables, we need to hear what those non-negotiables potentially are from our full group and then start to organize and triangulate our culture and recipe from there.
Thank you so much. This next question, I think Jonathan had started touching on in the chat. This is talking about overall organizational culture. And is it made up of real microcultures or the team clusters inside the organization?
Yeah, I'll touch on this really briefly. And I gave a little heads up on this of the question being, what happens when our team is remote or our team is large and there's more microcultures. Microcultures form when the macroculture for the entire organization is vague. You need to make sure that you're building an organization that is actually sharing its cultural DNA across all of its facets. Staff, board, volunteers, community partners, that culture should look and feel very, very, very similar. Small groups will find different ways for it to manifest. It might represent a slightly different way, have a slightly different kick to it in a small group, but it all has to sort of roll up into the macro organizational culture. Third Plateau is about 100 people. We're all over the country in like 20 something states. There are definitely microcultures around our organization, but nobody would look at one of those microcultures and not see immediate connecting dots back to the macro culture of what Third Plateau is for, and really helping inspire and support those micro teams to like take it and make it their own, but still cooking from that same recipe.
Thanks so much. Our next question was from Kathleen. For small orgs with no official HR, do you have recommendations on where these roles should sit when there's no specific HR director or team?
I can sort of look to that. I mean, I think that oftentimes when there's no, for small organizations, right, when you don't have an HR team, where this often sits honestly is with the leader and where it needs to sit, right? This is one of the most important things to get right for your organization, right? And I think actually vision, values, and driving that process, it's not something you can ever just hand off to one person in the organization, your HR manager, right? It starts with, Jeannie shared, engaging everybody and codifying and teasing out what are those values that we hold truly important. And then I think as a leader, it's really modeling those things and figuring out ways to recognize other leaders in the organization and frankly, every staff member in the organization when they demonstrate it so that it becomes palpable. I think this is never just sort of an HR director's responsibility, no matter what your size is.
Thanks, Allison. Veronica's question came in during Melissa's section. So I have a feeling this is going to be an agility question. I'm curious about thoughts on engagement for non-staff constituencies. As a nonprofit, we have thousands of volunteers who are critical to operations, but less of a captive audience. How do we get real critical mass of feedback when they are here and gone?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few opportunities there. An all staff survey, right, is a great opportunity to collect data from a really large data set at one time, right? So you could always run that. You could also just facilitate open spaces, right? So what works for a lot of our clients are kind of town halls or open sessions where you invite staff to come and open up a dialogue around some of your practices, your policies, et cetera, engage their perspectives there. If they are volunteers and they're working with you for a short time, right, it's always useful in HR to do kind of an exit survey for full-time staff, but it's just as useful to do that for your staff who are consulting or volunteers as well to learn about their perspectives. And you can still take that with you even after you've parted with your volunteers. I don't know, Allison, if you would add anything else on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I've seen organizations that do this really well. Like City Year, for example, they have an incredible onboarding program for their volunteers, and so much of it is about values. So I think again, it's making it really explicit to everybody in the organization and not just leaving it to chance, regardless of whether they are going to be with you for 10 years or 10 days, having some sort of process to communicate those things and demonstrate them and make them really clear and palpable.
Thank you, Marissa and Allison. We had one more question during the agility section. I'd love to hear more about pros and cons of using rating systems at all.
I mean, I can maybe get started, Allison, and then you jump in. So I would say, or sorry, should Third Plateau, do y'all want to, I don't want to take too much talking time here. Okay. Okay, pros and cons, right? So everything has pros and cons with a rating system. It's nice because it's a way to mathematically assign a score, which if you're tying, right, performance to pay or something like that, can then tie to a very straightforward percentage increase, right? If you're basing how folks move up their salary ranges on performance, it can be nice in that way. What can be, and the idea is that it's more objective, right? There's clear numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, what you score ties to your overall performance, ties to compensation. But what can be difficult about that is the same thing that's positive about that, right? Is that it's just numbers at the end of the day, right? And so we do have some clients that Rather than doing your traditional kind of 5-point scale, only do a 4-point scale because they don't want 2 points above performing competency because of the impact that that has on culture. So I think there are ways that you can even take a rating scale and try to make it more in line with your values by only having 3 points maybe as opposed to 5 points, and making your bar for success really explicit. I don't know if that exactly answered the question, and don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to tie on to that at all.
I think that what I would say is, again, it's what do you want the employee to walk away with, right? What do you want somebody to kind of get from this whole process, right? And I think that you want your staff to get headlines and lots of good developmental feedback and recognition if they're doing a great job, right? Think about the headlines, and those qualitative messages are extremely important, right? But you also may want them to get kind of a holistic picture. I'm sorry, a summative picture on a rating scale of like, what does that mean? Like when you add all of that together, what does that mean? And does that mean I'm sort of at mastery level, or, you know, kind of like that major headline? So I think that if that's kind of aligned with your culture, then that's what you should be doing. If numbers and ratings and you don't have like data-driven decision making as like a key value in your culture, then of course there's ways to do this differently. We're working with organizations that are sociocracies that might, you know, lean more on that qualitative methodology. There's no one right or wrong way to do this. You just have to make sure it really fits in with the culture that you're trying to build. I think the only other thing I would say is, from a qualitative standpoint, you know, if you're using numbers, it does make certain things easier. You know, the equity analysis that we talked about, you know, really sort of, especially if you're a larger organization, just kind of having a beat on the pulse overall. If you're a smaller organization, the qualitative methodology might work okay. So you just got to really make sure that you understand what you're trying to achieve and then build something that works for that.
I love that, Allison. I wanna end us sort of coming back to like the big picture where we started, and these like building blocks that we talked about. Um, Again, everything that we've been talking about is how we get really effective at doing the work we're trying to do. How do we make sure that our culture reinforces our strategic plan, our strategies, our priorities, that we're spending our resources and our energy in a way that is aligned and taking all of the wonderful humans we work with and getting them all rowing together to see something truly profound happen? How do we support them? What does that look like? And just want to like take a step back to remind all of that, like the rubric of how we think about that has got to stay anchored in what our communities need. None of us are here to run an organization for the sake of running an organization. We're all here because we want to see something be fundamentally different in the world. We want to see a better, more vibrant, more profound impact that we can have in our communities. And so we need to deeply understand who those communities are, what they need, design our organizations based on that, and then shape our strategy and our culture and our performance to make sure we're actually meeting their needs and delivering for them. And hopefully we can pull back the curtain a little bit into how that all works here. And happy to get into more conversations, but also happy to have you reach out afterwards. And we've got some contact information here as well. Joanna, any other next steps or last pieces?
Yes, thank you so much. First, I want to thank all of you for being with us today and participating. It was so great to hear from you in the chat. We loved your questions. I want to take a moment and thank our hosts for being with us and sharing their expertise. And also just want to ask you to please take this survey and let us know how we did today. I have dropped the link. Oops, that was only 2 panelists. I've dropped the link now in the chat to everyone. And also I'm going to drop everyone's email as well in the chat. So if there's anyone that you'd like to reach out to, please feel free to do so. We will follow up with email this week with the recording, the slides, and a few people have asked for resources. I have notes of that, and I will send those to you as well. Thank you so much again for being with us today, and have a wonderful rest of your week.